Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to show you how you can revamp, re-ink, and rejuvenate your ink pads. This video is brought to you by Lava Soap. You can find them online at lavasoap.com and find a store near you that stocks it. And at the end of this video, I will show you how good this guy is at getting all the inky mess off of your hands. Without further ado, let's go to the table and learn how to make some ink for your ink pads. Okay, now we're going to make some ink pads. We're going to refresh our ink pads, and I'm going to share some recipes and some ideas with you. The first thing I want to let you know is this is a messy project, so wear an old sweatshirt or something you don't care about getting inky. Also protect your work surface. I actually went ahead and painted my table with crazy colors so that I don't have to worry about ink spills anymore, but putting down a Teflon sheet is a great idea. I also recommend you have a piece of white scratch paper handy that you can stamp onto if needed. Maybe have a rubber stamp nearby in case you want to test your ink pads. First thing I'm going to do is show you how to re-ink an ink pad. Now, if you're going to invest in an ink pad, it's a good idea to buy a reinker as soon as it starts to go dry. If I'm at a stamp show and I'm buying an ink pad and I'm afraid I might not be able to get the reinker, I'll buy them together. But it can add to the expense since a stamp pad is usually around $6 and a reinker is usually around that too. So I'm going to re-ink this one. Now, this is actually one that had plenty of ink in it, but it went so long without being used that it got pretty dry. So what I'm going to do is just stamp that. This is also a semi-permanent ink, so it does tend to, you can see there's hardly any impression there. It does tend to dry up, so it might need to be re-inked a little more frequently. If you're using it daily, I don't think you're going to re-ink it any more than if you use it infrequently just because of the nature of the beast. So what I like to do is put a generous amount of ink down. I'm actually going to poke a little hole in the top of that. I feel like I have a little plug in there and I know I've got plenty of ink. Also make sure you clean off any tools if you're going to do that too. I don't know if I've ever actually re-inked this pad, but it's not that old. I'm wondering if there might be a stopper in that ink. There we go. If there is, I've poked a hole through it. See what I mean? I'm wondering if I had a little stopper in there or something. So you are going to get inky, and that's why we'll want our lava soap. Alright, so we're going to put that back in there. Holy moly, did I make a mess. And I've gone off my Teflon sheet already. Oh boy, I'm just going to sop that up. There we go. My table's clean. Don't do that if you've got a bunch of crud on your table. There we go. Now I'm just giving it a generous amount of ink and I'm watching it sink in. Okay, so if it sinks in really fast, you know that it's still absorbent and you need more ink. So what I will do is I'll keep adding ink until it stops sinking in. I know that might seem like it's a lot more than some other artists do, but I feel like it needs that extra amount because you want it to be fully saturated. You don't just want the middle or the edges saturated. You want the entire thing saturated. And just keep on adding ink until it stops absorbing. Now, if you feel like you have a big puddle and it's just not getting all over the ink pad, you can take a old credit card, old gift card, and just kind of spread that around and make sure you get a nice even application. I get about 6 refills from one bottle of ink, just to kind of give you an idea of how long it lasts. But I only usually need to re-ink my ink pads once a year, and those are ones that I use a lot. My mini ink pads I might need to re-ink a little more often. Now I generally like to let this sit for an hour or so before I use it, but I'm just going to give it a test. To see, it's already better, I can tell that. And let's give that a little test here and see how that stamps. There we go. So this is a gray ink pad. I got a really nice impression. A little bit darker on that side, but once it all settles in, it's going to be fine. So that's how you just go about and re-ink an ink pad. Hopefully you'll be a little bit neater than I am, but like I mentioned, prepare for a mess. You might not make one, and that would be great, but you'll be ready in case you do. So the next thing I'm going to show you is an alternative for using a reinker, because you know you might have an older ink pad that doesn't have a reinker for it. Maybe you didn't buy one when it came out, so you have to make your own. What I like to use is children's liquid watercolor. This is also really great if your kids have ink pads, because often they come in kits and they don't have reinkers. These are wonderful because they're non-toxic and you can reink your kids' inks with this. You can also re-ink your dye-based ink pads with this. Now this is kind of thin. If I put a drop of this down, I'm just going to show you. Let's put a drop of that down versus a drop of reinker, just so you can kind of see how different they are in texture here. Okay, so this is a little bit thicker than this. See, that's much waterier. That's a liquid watercolor. That's much thicker. That's a reinker. So just to kind of give you an idea. So if you're noticing that when you stamp with that, you've reinked with one of these liquid watercolors and you try to stamp with it, unfortunately I don't have any dry ink pads that I could use this method with. What you can do to thicken it up is add a product that is called vegetable glycerin. You can get this at any health food store. You can get it on Amazon for much cheaper. You can get it in a lot of craft stores where they sell cake decorating supplies. And what you do is just add a little bit of that to your dye ink, and that will improve the viscosity of it, so you get a little bit thicker of a result like you would with a reinker. So it does dilute it a little bit, but generally the liquid watercolors are very strong, so it shouldn't affect anything too badly. Now glycerin is a wonderful product because you can use it to re-ink your embossing ink pads like your Versamark or any other embossing ink pad that you have. This is really handy because I tend to get really kind of crazy with my mixed media techniques, and then I'll get my embossing pad dirty sometimes and I have to kind of rinse it off because I get embossing powder in it or something. So this is great. I can just use a little bit of this. It's very inexpensive. Even at the health food store where it's the most expensive, this big bottle was $6.49 for 16 ounces. It's not, you know, crazy. You can get it at the pharmacy as well. And then I would also just kind of spread it around with my scraper. Now, if you're getting the kind that they sell for like cake decorating, it's going to be a little thicker, so you'll need to dilute it. And I dilute it with isopropyl alcohol, and I get like the lower percentage, basically because I don't have distilled water. It's handy to keep this in a spray bottle, and I can just give that a spray. That will dilute it, and it will keep it from anything funky growing on there in case you have, you know, some sort of impurities in your water. So I just use the kind of low alcohol dose isopropyl alcohol for that. Okay. Now the next thing I want to talk about is re-inking a chalk ink pad. So here I have this color box ink pad. I'm not even sure if it's very juicy or not. I don't do a lot with chalk ink, so I'll give it a test. I mean, it's okay, but I didn't have another chalk ink pad to demonstrate with. But what I do when I need to re-ink a chalk ink pad is I grab some chalk, and I'm just going to choose my closest colors. I might need to mix a couple, so I'll see. Let's see. That's actually pretty close, but I think I might add a little darker in there too. And then what I would do is usually have something a little bit gritty. I think I'd be able to get up enough of the color this way. Kind of get off some of that chalk. I'm going to spray it with my alcohol. Oh, there we go. That works a little bit better. Just going to keep coloring a bunch until I get enough, which is not going to take too much on this ink pad because this ink pad is not really dry. And once I've got to kind of a nice kind of thin paste, then I'll just sop it up with my ink pad. So this is a pretty easy fix if you have any chalk ink pads. They were something that I tried a few years ago. I didn't really love them, but I had a few, so I knew I wasn't going to buy the reinkers because I didn't really love using a chalk ink pad, but this is a great way to kind of keep them in use if I decide I do want to use them. So I'm just going to gently tap it because it is pretty juicy. You want to let things set, but we'll give that a try here. And there we go. Stamps just fine. So that's how you can reduce your chalk ink pads. Like I said though, if it's an ink pad that you really depend on, that you love, buy the reinker because it's going to save you so much money in the long term. But this is kind of like your, you know, you're crafting at midnight, you need some ink stat, and you just, nothing's open and you can't, you know, you're in the middle of stamping a million birthday party invitations and you need your supplies now. So there we have a few different ideas. Now the next thing I'm going to show you is how to make your own ink pad. And this is just you can use this, you can do dye or pigment ink. So I've got cut and dry foam. This would be if you want to make a pigment ink pad. And I've got cut and dry felt, and this is if you want to make a dye-based ink pad. So what I'm going to do here is open up this package. Now this will run about $5 or so. I'm going to get out a little piece of the cut and dry felt. Now you're going to notice that one side is foamy. It kind of feels like styrofoam. The other side has like a linen texture on it. And I don't need that much of this. I'm just going to kind of cut off a piece like that. You can use any shears, you know, not your sewing scissors obviously, but you know, any shears. And I am just going to use this lid here. This is just one of the lids that my peg stamps came in. And I'm just going to set this down. You could, I'll try using a little double-sided tape, maybe a little score tape, stick that down into the lid so it doesn't move around, because that can be annoying if it's moving around on us. Now this would be a good situation if, say, you want a specialty ink pad because you're going to be stamping, you want to stamp something repeatedly and you're going to use the same colors for it. So I've got this tie-dyed stamp. It's from this stamp set called Tie-Dyed from Stampin' Up. I'm not sure if it's still available or not, but you could use any stamp that you'd want to put multiple colors on. You can do this with a solid color, but I think the best use of this is a multicolored stamp. And why don't I show you with the liquid watercolors? I'll show you what reinkers look like, just in case you're curious. I do have a bunch of reinkers. Reinkers per ounce are a lot more expensive than liquid watercolors. They're a little bit thicker, like I mentioned before, but let's say we want to do this with our liquid watercolors because we want to save some money. I'm going to use my primaries, magenta, turquoise, and yellow. And I think I'm going to go ahead and add a little glycerin to this stamp pad just to make sure everything's going to be thick enough. I'm just going to use my little pipette here. And the glycerin will just keep it from just all sinking down. It'll just give it a little bit thickness. Now, if you want to make your own ink pad refresher, I don't think I mentioned this before, you can take a tablespoon of this into a 4-ounce bottle of water, shake it up, and spray your dried out ink pads with that. Now, if your ink pad is just dry, it has plenty of ink, that's going to work great. If your ink pad is actually all used up, you're going to have a faint image. But for people that live in arid climates, high altitudes, their ink pads can go dry really quickly, and that's going to help you. Get a little bit more life out of that. So I'm going to start with yellow, and I'm going to put a couple drops down here. I'm going to do kind of like a color wheel. I'm going to use some magenta. Do some over here. Now I will use more drops than I would with regular reinker. I probably got about 10 here. We might only use like 5 of regular reinker because it's a lot stronger. And we'll do some cyan or turquoise. I'll put a little more yellow in there because yellow is the weakest of the colors. I've got this pretty rainbow ink pad that cost us pennies because these are pretty inexpensive and you get so much. Okay, so now we're going to test it out. It might be a little blobby at first because we just made it. The key is when you're doing a project like this is to remember what side is up. So what I'm going to do, I've got a little Lawn Fawn block. I'm going to keep the Lawn Fawn down to the lower left. And I'm going to ink up my stamp. Hopefully it's strong enough. Now you can see a little bit of beading on there because the liquid watercolor will bead up a little bit. I'm going to test this here. I think I'm probably going to need a little bit more glycerin. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. We actually got a pretty decent impression there. This was actually a layering set, and I'm using I'm just using this bottom layer here because I figured that would have the most area. So what I'm going to do is actually put a little bit more glycerin on there. Now you can store these and reuse these pads, so don't feel like they're just disposable. You can just save like a little clamshell packaging from something and you can reuse it. So don't feel like you have to just throw it away when you're done. But if I was just going to do like 1 or 2 images, I would definitely just use markers to ink it up because it's, you know, a little bit more, less work really to just do one thing. But if you're doing a whole party invitation run or something like that, then this is a good idea. with a little bit of trial and error here, and I might actually add some reinker on top just to show you how the reinker differs. Alright, so we'll ink that back up again. And I would probably do this a while before you're actually going to start stamping so the ink has a chance to even out. But there you can see that. We get a nice tie-dyed impression there. I think I'm going to get a more solid stamp so you can see it a little bit better. I'll use this balloon. This will give us a better idea of how good this ink is. And I'm seeing it beat up quite a bit here. So we're probably going to get a pretty beaten up image. So when your ink is like this, what you can do is let it sit and let some of the moisture absorb, because a liquid watercolor does have more moisture. But let's also try this with a actual reinker. A little yellow. So see, you can see kind of how much thicker it is. See, it doesn't absorb quite as quickly. This is actually a really cute ink pad. This will be a fun one to keep around and use. We will do some turquoise. And we will do some pink. So like I mentioned, the best practice is to buy the reinker for your ink pad, but this will do in a pinch. Okay, now we'll try inking up our balloon again. Now again, like I mentioned, let it sit typically. I want to make sure I get a nice even. It's a little thick because it's freshly inked. But you know, a reinker is going to give you a much stronger image than a liquid watercolor. So I just wanted to put that out there. After this sits for a bit, we can try this again at the end and then see if it stamps a lot better. We can try a tie-dye with it again while it's still... Whoa. Yeah, I mean, just the thickness of the reinker does make a big difference. But it's more expensive, so just kind of keep that in mind as you're working. You can see that. You get a much bolder image. But either way, it's pretty, and you have some options there, and you can make this at home. So that's cut and dry felt if you're using dye, or cut and dry foam if you're going to use pigment ink. Because pigment ink likes that squishier, foamier texture. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to show you is how to make your own pigment ink. So pigment ink pads I don't think they're as popular as dye ink pads, and I've had this one for, gosh, a long time, probably 20 years. It's a burgundy ink pad. I think I might have even had this during my wedding to do some stamping. So what I'm going to do is make an ink for this. So I'm going to start off with some gouache, and gouache is an opaque watercolor. And I'm going to put out a little bit, probably about the size of a pea or a blueberry, if that. And this color is actually just about perfect. And I splashed a little bit on the thing. You can see it's just about perfect. I might add just a smidgen of crimson to that, though, because I do think it has a little bit more saturation, just a tiny little bit. And now I'm going to add in a little bit of glycerin. Going to add probably 5 drops. And actually, let's test our ink pad first. I'm going to get another scrap of paper because I used up the other one pretty well. So let me clean off this stamp pad. Oh, I want to show you my stamp cleaner. This is a wipes box back from when my kids were babies. And I put 2 paint pads on the inside. I did a video on this many years ago, but I thought I'd revisit it. I spray my cleaner on the wet side, and then I just dry it on the dry side. And those little fingers on the paint pads, you know, like paint edgers, it just cleans up all the nooks and crannies. It works really good. Okay, so let's give us a test here of before. This one actually may not be too bad. I mean, it actually is pretty pale. For a pigment ink pad, it's pretty pale. You can see that. So now I'm going to mix that up with a palette knife. Or you can use a piece of credit card or old gift card. So see this texture here, this consistency? You want this consistency. It's about like a heavy cream consistency. And then you're going to apply it to your ink pad. Just like that. Just kind of in kind of like a spatula motion. It's not going to sink in as much as a dye reinker. I do this pretty much for all of my pigment ink pads. I find this is a really reliable way to do the pigment ink. I don't feel like I am sacrificing anything. Like I feel like I'm sacrificing a little bit when I use liquid watercolors to re-ink my artist ink pads, like my stamping ink pads. I feel like I get about the same quality if I'm re-inking a kid's ink pad with the liquid watercolors. But for my tried and true stamping ink pads, I like to use reinkers. But I don't feel like I'm sacrificing anything when I do this with my crafting pads or my pigment ink pads. Clean that up. Actually, the alcohol in a spray bottle is also really good for cleaning up stuff like this. There we go. Okay. And now we'll give this another test. Now again, you can let it sit for a bit. I find the pigment ink pads are a little bit more ready to go right off the bat. Just give it a very gentle press because with these foamy pads, they're squishier. So what happens is you can push the Stampin' too far and end up getting a really, look at that. You get all the ink in the nooks and crannies. You don't want that. You just want a light tap. Now look how good that stamps. So I don't think you sacrifice anything with that. So you can get by with a small set of gouache to mix any color you want, but if you're not that great at mixing and you want some kind of pre-made colors, you can get a set like this that has 60 colors, which will, this is by Arteza, which will pretty much tackle anything. I think this is around 40 or 50 bucks for this set of 60, but then again, when you're thinking about 60 ink pad refills, you'd pay a heck of a lot more for that. You'd pay about $6 a piece, and that would be a little crazy. And I find the pigment ink refills a little bit more difficult to find than the dye ink ones. And even at that, I have to order the dye ink ones online usually. Okay, so there, boy, we've done embossing, we've done pigment, we've done dye. Oh, specialty inks. So this is what the whole idea for this video came from. I had bought some ink pads at a stamp show. Buyer beware. The seller even told me they might be dry. I don't know. I think he did know they were dry. And they were Pearlex ink pads. So Pearlex is a product that has mica in it. Well, it comes in little pots like this or even bigger ones, and it's got mica in it, which is a really nice pigment powder. Oftentimes you stamp with a clear ink and then you brush over the pigment powder and it's gorgeous. Well, they came out with ink pads probably in like 2004 or so, and they had a bunch of these for $1 at a stamp show, so I couldn't resist. I bought them, and they were dry as a bone, and I was actually going through stuff. I was throwing them away, and then I thought, you know what, I want to make some alcohol lifting, so I put alcohol, denatured alcohol, on these pads, on one of these pads to make a lift pad, and then I realized that I could actually get some of the product up. Let me flip that over. And so this one started stamping like, well, you can't see it now. That one was giving me like you can see on the stamp is a little bit of a blue. So I was getting a little bit of color. I was like, oh, well, maybe I can revive this ink pad. Then I realized I have Pearlex, so I totally can revive this ink pad. So what you want to do in this case is I would spray your pad with a little bit of you could use rubbing alcohol or denatured alcohol. It doesn't really matter here. You just want to moisten it. Then you're going to want to put some glycerin on. This is the same as doing a pigment ink because this is a pigment ink. It's kind of spongy pad. And I do this right on the ink pad rather than mixing it on a palette or on my mat first, just because the powder is a little bit unwieldy. And then I'm going to put in a little bit of the powder, and what I'm going to do is actually use the end of a brush or the end of a tool just to get a little bit in there. You don't need a ton. You just need a little bit. And this is the same color as the Pearlex pad. This is interference blue, which means it looks a little different depending on how the light is. Okay, so now I want to, and you want to spray this with your water or your alcohol. I recommend rubbing alcohol first, because once you, if you try to spray water on this now, it's going to send some of that pigment powder flying. So then I'm just gently going to use this credit card here, old Subway gift card, to spread around my color. Now you can actually add some gouache to this if you want. If you do add gouache, it's going to make it a little bit less sparkly because gouache is opaque. You could add some water-based reinker, but it's not going to show up on a dark cardstock, and that's what this like metallic stuff is really good for. And if you're doing a regular metallic pad, you can actually use metallic gouache. That's in that 60 color set. So now just inking it up, I can see I've got some of that pigment on there. It looks pretty. And there. Now, when I dry that, you're going to see that that it's got a really beautiful blue sheen. I'll bring it back over after we're all done so you can see it all dry. Now, pads that are a little fussy, that tend to dry out, often come with one of these little guys. It's important you keep this. Don't throw it away. It's there so that it can prevent your pad from drying out. All of these pads that I refreshed and re-inked on my own had those little liners in there. That's just going to keep the moisture on the ink pad because it will tend to dry out on you. So don't throw that away. Some people will use foam tape to actually attach it to the lid, and that's a great idea. There is quite a gap in there, so you might need a few layers if you're going to do that. But I know a lot of people do that with their Memento ink pads, and their, actually not Memento, their Stays-On ink pads. For when I was, and I just want to go into this really quickly, when I was re-inking this one, it was just gold, so I used, or copper, and it was gold, so I just used my Arteza gold gouache, just like I did with this ink pad, just added some glycerin to it, mixed it up and put it in there, and it worked great. So metallic and regular pigment ink pads are pretty much the same. These interference ones were a little bit different. They don't have a pigment, they don't have a colored pigment, they just have the mica pigment like I just showed you. So there is that. And the last thing I want to show you is alcohol inks, because they are probably the most tricky and the most often to dry out on you. Okay, alcohol inks are kind of fussy. They're kind of like the ink that's in a Sharpie. Actually, they're exactly like that. And they want to dry out really easily. So what I find a lot of times with these Stays-On ink pads is that they go dry before I've used the ink up. And if you keep inking it up, re-inking it with Reinker, when it's still got plenty of ink in there, it gets sticky. And it's just kind of a pain to work with. So again, this has that liner in there just to give it a little help to keep from drying out. And my ink pads usually don't dry out on their own too badly because I work in a basement, I don't have any windows, I don't have any heat, so there's nothing here to really dry it out. If you live someplace where it's really sunny and hot and dry, you're going to run into more issues. So let's just try this brown one. I don't know how good it is. It looks like it's not too bad. You know, it's kind of faint though. You can kind of see that right there. I mean, it's okay. It's not perfect. So what happens if I feel like there's plenty of ink in there, but it's dried out on me? What I use is a product called Denatured Alcohol. So you can get this at any hardware store. It's about, I would say a big jug like this is probably about $5, $5 to $7, I'd say. And it's kind of a pain to open because you've got to kind of get a screwdriver in there or a pair of scissors and kind of pop it up. So what I do is I take some and I pour it out into something else. So for this, I'm actually just going to grab a clean pipette and pull out a little bit of that alcohol, a few drops. Okay, and I am just going to put a few drops on the ink pad, and that is just going to get in there, and it is going to break up and reconstitute any of the ink that is in the ink pad. So if you've noticed that you've been using your reinkers on your Stays-On pads, but your stamp is just sticking to the pad, it's not giving you a good impression, then use a little alcohol, because you've probably got ink in the ink pad that's a little too thick. Now this is probably not quite ready for stamping, but I'll give it a try anyway. I usually like to let it sit for a bit before I try to stamp with it. I'll give it a try. Oh, but look at that. Just after a few seconds, it's already nice and crisp. I didn't add any more ink, but it was able to refresh it. So that's how you refresh your alcohol inks, ink pads, if you know you have plenty of alcohol in there. And then I do recommend getting the reinkers for the colors you use a lot, just because this is one of those specialty inks where if you're stamping on glass or ceramics or something non-porous where you need that permanent ink, it's just really handy. Now I also wanted to mention the Stays-On Opaque, because this comes with a bottle of ink and it comes uninked. At least mine did, and you have to add ink every single time that you stamp with it. So only put on a little bit, just enough for you to do whatever project run you're doing when you're using the Stays-On Opaque White, just because it's going to dry out on you, and that way you can conserve your products a little bit and use them the way they're intended. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'm going to go upstairs and clean the ink off my hands. I actually didn't get as messy as I thought, and I hope lava can take care of this. It might not be able to get it off my fingernail, but I'm sure it's going to get it off my skin. So let's go to the sink and see how well the lava works. Oh, I almost forgot to show you these examples here. This was my pre-ink pad heart. You can barely see it. There's the one with my Pearl X ink that I made. It's all dry now. And I also did another stamping of the tie-dye and the balloon there, so you can see even just in the 20 minutes since we made that ink pad how it's settled out and it's stamping much more nice. So give it a little time after you've re-inked or made an ink pad to make sure that the ink has dispersed itself evenly, and then you'll get a much better impression. Now we get to put the soap to the test and see if it will take off the ink that I have on my hands. I don't know if it'll get the ink that's on my fingernails off or not, but it should make light work of what I have on my hands. And make sure you check out the video description for links to where you can find this soap near you. So you usually don't need too much water there, just get it good and lathered up. If you have any real tricky spots, just rub those areas right on the bar of soap so you can get the pumice in there to take care of everything. Look at all that coming off there. Stamping ink can be really tricky, especially blacks and reds. All right, it's looking pretty good. It's taken off all of the ink except for what is under my fingernails. I always get a little bit underneath there and then have a hard time getting that off, but it looks pretty good to me. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, these ink recipes. They were a lot of fun to come up with, and they can certainly save your project in a pinch. Please check out the video description for links to where you can find lava soap and all of the other products I used to make our homemade ink today. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.